Now consider the tortoise and the eagle. The tortoise is a ground-living creature. It is impossible to live nearer to the ground without being under it. Its horizons are a few inches away. It has about as good a turn of speed as you need to hunt down a lettuce. It has survived while the rest of evolution flowed past it by being, on the whole, no threat to anyone and too much trouble to eat. And then there is the eagle, a creature of the air and high places, whose horizons go all the way to the edge of the world, eyesight keen enough to spot the rustle of some small and squeaky creature half a mile away, all power, all control, lightning death on wings, talons and claws enough to make a meal of anything smaller than it is, and at least take a hurried snack out of anything bigger. And yet, the eagle will sit for hours on the crag and survey the kingdoms of the world until it spots a distant movement, and then it will focus on the small shell wobbling among the bushes down there on the desert, and it will leap. And a minute later, the tortoise finds the world dropping away from it, and it sees the world for the first time, no longer 1 inch from the ground, but 500 feet above it, and it thinks, what a great friend I have in the eagle. And then the eagle lets go. And almost always the tortoise plunges to its death. Everyone knows why the tortoise does this. Gravity is a habit that is hard to shake off. No one knows why the eagle does this. There's good eating on a tortoise, but considering the effort involved, there's much better eating on practically anything else. It's simply the delight of eagles to torment tortoises. But of course, what the eagle does not realize is that it is participating in a very crude form of natural selection. One day, a tortoise will learn how to fly. The story takes place in desert lands, in shades of umber and orange. When it begins and ends is more problematical, but at least one of its beginnings took place above the snowline, thousands of miles away in the mountains around the hub. One of the recurring philosophical questions is, does a falling tree in the forest make a sound when there is no one to hear? Which says something about the nature of philosophers, because there is always someone in the forest. It may only be a badger, wondering what that cracking noise was, or a squirrel, a bit puzzled by the scenery going upwards, but someone. At the very least, if it was deep enough in the forest, millions of small gods would have heard it. Things just happen, one after another. They don't care who knows, but history. History is different. History has to be observed. Otherwise, it's not history. It's just things happening one after another. And, of course, it has to be controlled. Otherwise, it might turn into anything. Because history, contrary to popular theories, is kings and dates and battles. And these things have to happen at the right time. This is difficult. In a chaotic universe, there are too many things to go wrong. It's too easy for a general's horse to lose a shoe at the wrong time, or for someone to mishear an order, or for the carrier of the vital message to be waylaid by some men with sticks and a cash flow problem. Then there are wild stories, parasitic growths on the tree of history, trying to bend it their way. So, history has its caretakers. They live, in the nature of things, they live wherever they are sent, but their spiritual home is in a hidden valley in the high ramtops of the Discworld, where the books of history are kept. These aren't books in which the events of the past are pinned like so many butterflies to a cork. These are the books from which history is derived. There are more than 20,000 of them. Each one is 10 feet high, bound in lead, and the letters are so small that they have to be read with a magnifying glass. When people say it is written here. There are fewer metaphors around than people think. Every month, the abbot and 2 senior monks go into the cave where the books are kept. It used to be the duty of the abbot alone, but 2 other reliable monks were included after the unfortunate case of the 59th abbot, who made $1 million in small bets before his fellow monks caught up with him. Besides, it's dangerous to go in alone. The sheer concentratedness of history, sleeting past soundlessly out into the world, can be overwhelming. Time is a drug. Too much of it kills you. The 493rd abbot folded his wrinkled hands and addressed Lutzi, one of the most senior monks. The clear air and untroubled life of the secret valley was such that all the monks were senior. Besides, when you work with time every day, some of it tends to rub off. The place is Omnia, said the abbot, on the Klachian coast. I remember, said Lutzi. Young fellow called Ossury, wasn't there? Things must be carefully observed, said the abbot. There are pressures. Free will, predestination, the power of symbols, turning point. You know all this. Haven't been to Omnia for, must be 700 years, said Lutzi. Dry place. Shouldn't think there's a ton of good soil in the whole country, either. Off you go, said the abbot. I shall take my mountains, said Lutzi. The climate will be good for them. And he also took his broom and his sleeping mat. The history monks don't go in for possessions. They find most things wear out in a century or two. It took him 4 years to get to Omnia. He had to watch a couple of battles and an assassination on the way, otherwise they would just have been random events. It was the year of the notional serpent, or 200 years after the declaration of the prophet Abbess, which meant that the time of the 8th prophet was imminent. That was the reliable thing about the Church of the Great Alm. It had very punctual prophets. You could set your calendar by them if you had one big enough. And as is generally the case around the time a prophet is expected, the church redoubled its efforts to be holy. This was very much like the bustle you get in any large concern when the auditors are expected, but tended toward taking people suspected of being less holy and putting them to death in 100 ingenious ways. This is considered a reliable barometer of the state of one's piety in most of the really popular religions. There's a tendency to declare that there is more backsliding around than the national toboggan championships, that heresy must be torn out root and branch, and even arm and leg and eye and tongue, and that it's time to wipe the slate clean. Blood is generally considered very efficient for this purpose. And so it came to pass that in the time the great god Om spake unto Brutha, the chosen one. Psst! Brutha paused in mid-hoe and stared around the temple garden. Pardon? He said. It was a fine day early in the lesser spring. The prayer mill spun merrily in the breeze off the mountains. Bees loafed around in the bean blossoms, but buzzed fast in order to give the impression of hard work. High above, a lone eagle circled. Brutha shrugged and got back to the melons. Ye, the great god Om spake again unto Brutha, the chosen one. Psst! Brutha hesitated. Someone had definitely spoken to him out of the air. Perhaps it was a demon. Novice Master Brother Numrod was hot on the subject of demons. Impure thoughts and demons. One led to the other. Brutha was uncomfortably aware that he was probably overdue a demon. The thing to do was to be resolute and repeat the 9 fundamental aphorisms. Once again the great god Om spake unto Brutha, the chosen one. Are you deaf, boy? The hoe thudded onto the baking soil. Brutha spun around. There were bees, the eagle, and, at the far end of the garden, old brother Lutzi, dreamily forking over a dung heap. The prayer mill was whirling reassuringly along the walls. He made the sign with which the prophet Ishkabul had cast out spirits. Get thee behind me, demon, he muttered. I am behind you. Brutha turned again, slowly. The garden was still empty. He fled. Many stories start long before they begin, and Brutha's story had its origins thousands of years before his birth. There are billions of gods in the world. They swarm as thick as herring roe. Most of them are too small to see and never get worshipped, at least by anything bigger than bacteria, who never say their prayers and don't demand much in the way of miracles. They are the small gods, the spirits of places where two ant trails cross, the gods of microclimates down between the grassroots, and most of them stay that way. Because what they lack is belief. A handful, though, go on to greater things. Anything may trigger it. A shepherd seeking a lost lamb finds it among the briars and takes a minute or two to build a small cairn of stones in general thanks to whatever spirits might be around the place. Or a peculiarly shaped tree might become associated with a cure for a disease, or someone carves a spiral on an isolated stone. Because what gods need is belief, and what humans want is gods. Often it stops there, but sometimes it goes further. More rocks are added, more stones are raised, a temple is built on the site where the tree once stood. The god grows in strength, the belief of its worshippers raising it upward like 1,000 tons of rocket fuel. For very few, the sky's the limit, and sometimes not even that. Brother Numrod was wrestling with impure thoughts in the privacy of his severe cell when he heard the fervent voice from the novitiate's dormitory. The Brutha boy was flat on his face in front of a statue of Om in his manifestation as a thunderbolt, shaking and gabbling fragments of prayer. There's something creepy about that boy, Numrod thought. It was the way he looked at you when you were talking, as if he were listening. He wandered out and prodded the prone youth with the end of his cane. Get up, boy! What do you think you're doing in the dormitory in the middle of the day, Brutha managed to spin around while still flat on the floor and grasped the priest's ankles. A voice, it spoke to me, he wailed. Numrod breathed out. Ha, this was familiar ground. Voices are right up Numrod's cloister. He heard them all the time. Get up, boy, he said, slightly more kindly. Brutha got to his feet. He was, as Numrod had complained before, too old to be a proper novice. About 10 years too old. Give me a boy up to the age of 7, Numrod had always said. But Brutha was going to die a novice. When they made the rules, they'd never allowed for anything like Brutha. His big red honest face stared up at the novice master. Sit down on your bed, Brutha, said Numrod. Brutha obeyed immediately. Brutha did not know the meaning of the word disobedience. It was only one of a large number of words he didn't know the meaning of. Numrod sat down beside him. Now, Brutha, he said, you know what happens to people who tell falsehoods, don't you? Brutha nodded, blushing. Very well, now tell me about these voices. Brutha twisted the hem of his robe in his hands. It was more like one voice, master, he said. Like one voice, said Brother Numrod. And what did that voice say, Brutha hesitated. Now, he came to think about it, the voice hadn't said anything much, it had just spoken. It was, in any case, hard to talk to Brother Numrod, who had a nervous habit of squinting at the speaker's lips and repeating the last few words they said practically as they said them. He also touched things all the time. Walls, furniture, people. As if he was afraid the universe would disappear if he didn't keep hold of it. And he had so many nervous tics that they had to hold a queue. Brother Numrod was perfectly normal for someone who had survived in the Citadel for 50 years. Well, Brutha began. Brother Numrod held up a skinny hand. Brutha could see the pale blue veins in it. And I'm sure you know that there are two kinds of voices that are heard by the spiritual, said the Master of Novices. One eyebrow began to twitch. Yes, Master. Brother Murdoch told us, said Brutha meekly. Told us that. Yes, sometimes, as he in his infinite wisdom sees fit, the god speaks to the chosen one and he becomes a great prophet, said Numrod. Now, I'm sure you wouldn't presume to consider yourself one of them, No, Master. Master, but there are other voices, said Brother Numrod, and now his voice had a slight tremolo. Beguiling and wheedling and persuasive voices, yes? Voices that are always waiting to catch us off our guard. Brutha relaxed. This was more familiar ground. All the novices knew about those kinds of voices, except that usually they talked about fairly straightforward things like the pleasures of nighttime manipulation the general desirability of girls, which showed that they were novices when it came to voices. Brother Numrod got the kinds of voices that were, by comparison, a full oratorio. Some of the bolder novices liked to get Brother Numrod talking on the subject of voices. He was an education, they said, especially when little bits of white spit appeared at the corners of his mouth. Brutha listened. Brother Numrod was the novice master, but he wasn't the novice master. He was only master of the group that included Brutha. There were others. Possibly someone in the Citadel knew how many there were. There was someone somewhere whose job it was to know everything. The Citadel occupied the whole of the heart of the city of Qom, in the lands between the deserts of Klatch and the plains and jungles of Hawandaland. It extended for miles, its temples, churches, schools, dormitories, gardens, and towers growing into and around one another in a way that suggested a million termites all trying to build their mounds at the same time. When the sun rose, the reflections of the doors of the central temple blazed like fire. They were bronze and 100 feet tall. On them, in letters of gold set in lead, were the commandments. There were 512 so far, and doubtless the next prophet would add his share. The sun's reflected glow shone down and across the tens of thousands of strong in faith who labored below for the greater glory of the great god Om. Probably no one did know how many of them there were. Some things have a way of going critical. Certainly there was only one Cenobiarch, the superior Iam, that was certain, and 6 archpriests and 30 lesser Iams, and hundreds of bishops, deacons, subdeacons, and priests, and novices like rats in a grain store, and craftsmen, and bull breeders, and torturers, and vestigial virgins. No matter what your skills, there was a place for you in the Citadel. And if your skill lay in asking the wrong kinds of questions or losing the righteous kinds of wars, the place might just be the furnaces of purity or the Quisition's pits of justice. A place for everyone, and everyone in their place. The sun beat down on the temple garden. The great god Om tried to stay in the shade of a melon vine. He was probably safe here inside these walls and with the prayer tower all around. But you couldn't be too careful. He'd been lucky once, but it was asking too much to expect to be lucky again. The trouble with being a god is that you've got no one to pray to. He crawled forward purposefully towards the old man shoveling muck until, after much exertion, he judged himself to be within earshot. He spake thusly, "Hey, you!" There was no answer. There was not even any suggestion of that anything had been heard. Om lost his temper and turned Ludzi into a lowly worm in the deepest cesspit of hell, and then got even more angry when the old man went on peacefully shoveling. "The devils of infinity fill your living bones with sulfur," he screamed. This did not make a great deal of difference. "Devil bugger," muttered the great god Om. Or perhaps there was someone who did know all there was to be known about the Citadel. There's always someone who collects knowledge, not because of a love of the stuff, but in the same way that a magpie collects glitter or a caddisfly collects bits of twigs and rock. And there's always someone who has to do all those things that need to be done, but which other people would rather not do, or even acknowledge existed. The third thing the people noticed about Vorbis was his height. He was well over 6 feet tall, but stick-thin, like a normal proportioned person modeled in clay by a child and then rolled out. The second thing people noticed about Vorbis was his eyes. His ancestors had come from one of the deep desert tribes that had evolved the peculiar trait of having dark eyes, not just dark of pupil, but almost black of eyeball. It made it very hard to tell where he was looking. It was as if he had sunglasses on under his skin. But the first thing they noticed was his skull. Deacon Vorbis was bald by design. Most of the church's ministers, as soon as they were ordained, cultivated long hair and beards that you could lose a goat in. But Vorbis shaved all over. He gleamed, and lack of hair seemed to add to his power. He didn't menace, he never threatened. He just gave everyone the feeling that his personal space radiated several meters from his body, and that anyone approaching Vorbis was intruding on something important. Superiors 50 years his senior felt apologetic about interrupting whatever it was he was thinking about. It was almost impossible to know what he was thinking about, and no one ever asked. The most obvious reason for this was that Vorbis was the head of the Quisition, whose job it was to do all those things that needed to be done, and which other people would rather not do. You do not ask people like that what they are thinking about, in case they turn around very slowly and say, "You." The highest post that could be held in the Quisition was that of deacon, a rule instituted hundreds of years ago to prevent this branch of the church becoming too big for its boots. But with a mind like his, everyone said he could easily be an archpriest by now, or even an iam. Vorbis didn't worry about that kind of trivia. Vorbis knew his destiny. Hadn't the god himself told him? "There," said Brother Numrod, patting Brutha on the shoulder. "I'm sure you will see things clearer now." Brutha felt that a specific reply was expected. "Yes, master," he said. "I'm sure I shall." "Shall? It is your holy duty to resist the voices at all times," said Numrod, still patting. "Yes, master, I will, especially if they tell me to do any of the things you mentioned." "Mentioned. Good, good. And if you hear them again, what will you do? Come and tell you," said Brutha dutifully. "Tell you. Good, good. That's what I like to hear," said Numrod. "That's what I tell all my boys. Remember that I'm always here to deal with any little problems that may be bothering you." "Yes, master. Shall I go back to the garden now?" "Now, I think so, and no more voices, do you hear?" Numrod waved a finger of his non-patting hand. A cheek puckered. "Yes, master." "What were you doing in the garden?" "Hoeing the melons, master," said Brutha. "Melons? Ah, melons," said Numrod slowly. Melons. Well, that goes some way towards explaining things, of course." An eyelid flickered madly. It wasn't just the great god that spoke to Vorbis in the confines of his head. Everyone spoke to an inquisitor, sooner or later. It was just a matter of stamina. Vorbis didn't often go down to watch the inquisitors at work these days. Exquisitors didn't have to. He sent down instructions, he received reports, but special circumstances merited his special attention. It has to be said, there was little to laugh at in the cellar of the Quisition. Not if you had a normal sense of humor. There were no jolly little signs saying, "You don't have to be pitilessly sadistic to work here, but it helps." But there were things to suggest to a thinking man that the creator of mankind had a very oblique sense of fun indeed, and to breed in his heart a rage to storm the gates of heaven. The mugs, for example. The Inquisitor stopped working twice a day for coffee. Their mugs, which each man had brought from home, were grouped around the kettle on the hearth in the central furnace, which incidentally heated the irons and knives. They had legends on them like "A present from the Holy Grotto of Ossuary" or "To the world's greatest daddy." Most of them were chipped, and no two were the same. And then there were the postcards on the wall. It was traditional that, when an Inquisitor went on holiday, he'd send back crudely colored woodcut of the local view that with some suitably jolly and risque message on the back. And there was a pinned up tearful letter from the Inquisitor First Class Ishmael Pop Quoom, thanking all the lads for collecting no fewer than 78 obols for his retirement present, and the lovely bunch of flowers for the Miss Quoom, indicating that he'd always remember his days in number 3 pit, and was looking forward to coming in and helping out any time they were short-handed. And it all meant this, that there were hardly any excesses of the most crazed psychopath that cannot easily be duplicated by a normal, kindly family man who just comes into work every day and has a job to do. Vorbis loved knowing that. A man who knew that knew everything he needed to know about people. Currently, he was sitting alongside the bench on which lay what was still, technically, the trembling body of Brother Sasho, formerly his secretary. He looked up at the duty inquisitor, who nodded. Vorbis leaned over the chained secretary. "What were their names?" he repeated. "Don't know." "I know you gave them copies of my correspondence, Sasho. They are treacherous heretics who will spend eternity in the hells. Will you join them?" "Don't know names." "I trusted you, Sasho. You spied on me. You betrayed the church." "No names." "Truth is a surcease from pain, Sasho. Tell me." "Truth." Vorbis sighed, and then he saw one of Sasho's fingers curling and uncurling under the manacles, beckoning. "Yes?" He leaned closer to the body. Sasho opened his one remaining eye. "Truth." "Yes?" "The turtle moves." Vorbis sat back, his expression unchanged. His expression seldom changed unless he wanted it to. The Inquisitor watched him in terror. "I see," said Vorbis. He stood up and nodded at the Inquisitor. "How long has he been down here?" 2 days, Lord." "And you can keep him alive for?" "Perhaps 2 days more, Lord." Do so. Do so. It is, after all," said Vorbis, "our duty to preserve life for as long as possible, is it not?" The Inquisitor gave him the nervous smile of one in the presence of a superior whose merest word could see him manacled on a bench. Yes, Lord." Heresy and lies everywhere," Vorbis sighed. "And now I shall have to find another secretary. It is too vexing." After 20 minutes, Brutha relaxed. The siren voices of sensuous evil seemed to have gone. He got on with the melons. He felt capable of understanding melons. Melons seemed a lot more comprehensible than most things. "Hey, you!" Brutha straightened up. "I do not hear you, oh foul succubus," he said. "Oh, yes you do, boy. Now, what I want you to do is... I've got my fingers in my ears. Suits you, makes you look like a vase. Now, I'm humming a tune. Brother Preptil, the master of music, had described Brutha's voice as putting him in mind of a disappointed vulture arriving too late at the dead donkey. Choral singing was compulsory for novitiates, but after much petitioning by Brother Preptil, a special dispensation had been made for Brutha. The sight of his big round face screwed up in the effort to please was bad enough, but what was worse was listening to his voice, which was certainly powerful and full of intent, conviction, swinging backward and forward across the tune without ever hitting it. He got extra melons instead. Up in the prayer towers, a flock of crows took off in a hurry. After a full chorus of "He is trampling the unrighteous with hooves of hot iron," Brutha unplugged his ears and risked a quick listen. Apart from the distant protests of the crows, there was silence. It worked. Put your trust in God, they said, and he always had, as far back as he could remember. He picked up his hoe and turned back, in relief, to the vines. The hoe's blade was about to hit the ground when Brutha saw the tortoise. It was small and basically yellow and covered with dust. Its shell was badly chipped. It had one beady eye. The other had fallen to one of the thousands of dangers that attend any slow-moving creature which lives an inch from the ground. He looked around. The gardens were well inside the temple complex and surrounded by high walls. "How did you get in here, little creature?" he said. "Did you fly?" The tortoise stared monoptically at him. Brutha felt a bit homesick. There had been plenty of tortoises in the sandy hills back home. "I could give you some lettuce," said Brutha, "but I don't think tortoises are allowed in the gardens. Aren't you vermin?" The tortoise continued to stare. Practically nothing can stare like a tortoise. Brutha felt obliged to do something. There's grapes," he said. It's probably not sinful to give you one grape. How would you like a grape, little tortoise?" "How would you like to be an abomination in the nethermost pit of chaos?" said the tortoise. The crows who had fled to the outer walls took off again to a rendering of the way of the infidel as a nest of thorns. Brutha opened his eyes and took his fingers out of his ears again. The tortoise said, "I'm still here." Brutha hesitated. It dawned on him very slowly that demons and succubi didn't turn up looking like small old tortoises. There wouldn't be much point. Even Brother Numrod would have to agree that when it came to rampant eroticism, you could do a lot better than a one-eyed tortoise. "I didn't know tortoises could talk," he said. "They can't," said the tortoise. "Read my lips." Brutha looked closer. "You haven't got lips," he said. "No, nor proper vocal cords," agreed the tortoise. "I'm doing it straight into your head. Do you understand?" "Gosh! You do understand, don't you?" No." The tortoise rolled its eye. "I should have known. Well, it doesn't matter. I don't have to waste time on gardeners. Go and fetch the top man right now." "Top man?" said Brutha. Put his hand to his mouth. "You don't mean Brother Numrod?" Who's he?" said the tortoise. "The master of the novices." "Oh, me," said the tortoise. "No," it went on in a sing-song imitation of Brutha's voice. "I don't mean the master of novices. I mean the high priest or whatever he calls himself. I suppose there is one?" Brutha nodded blankly. "High priest, right?" said the tortoise. "High priest. High priest." Brutha nodded again. He knew there was a high priest. It was just that, while he could just about encompass the hierarchical structure between his own self and Brother Numrod, he was unable to give serious consideration to any kind of link between Brutha, the novice, and the Cenobiarch. He was theoretically aware that there was one, and that there was a huge canonical structure with the high priest at the top and Brutha very firmly at the bottom. But he viewed it in the same way as an amoeba might view the chain of evolution all the way between itself and, for example, a chartered accountant. It was missing links all the way to the top. "I can't go asking the..." Brutha hesitated. Even the thought of talking to the Cenobiarch frightened him into silence. "I can't ask anyone to ask the high Cenobiarch to come and talk to a tortoise." "Turn into a mud leech and wither in the fires of retribution," screamed the tortoise. "There's no need to curse," said Brutha. The tortoise bounced up and down furiously. "It wasn't a curse. That was an order. I am the great god Om." Brutha blinked. Then he said, "No, you're not. I've seen the great god Om," he said, waving a hand making the shape of the holy horns conscientiously. "And he isn't a tortoise shaped. He comes as an eagle or a lion or a mighty bull. There's a statue in the great temple. It's 7 cubits high. It's got bronze on it and everything. It's trampling infidels. You can't trample infidels when you're a tortoise. I mean, all you could do is give them a meaningful look. It's got horns of real gold. Where I used to live, there was a statue 1 cubit high in the next village that was a bull too. So that's how I know you're not the great god. Holy horns, The tortoise subsided. "How many talking tortoises have you met?" it said sarcastically. "I don't know," said Brutha. "What do you mean you don't know?" "Well, they might all talk," said Brutha conscientiously, demonstrating the very personal kind of logic that got him extra melons. "They just might not say anything when I'm there." "I am the great god Om," said the tortoise in a menacing and unavoidably low voice, "and before very long you are going to be a very unfortunate priest. Go and get him." "Novice," said Brutha. "What?" "Novice, not priest. They won't let me." "Get him!" "But I don't think the Cenobiarch ever comes into our vegetable garden." "I don't think he even knows what a melon is." "I'm not bothered about that," said the tortoise. "Fetch him now, or there will be a shaking of the earth. The moon will be as blood. Agues and boils will affect mankind, and diverse ills will befall. I really mean it," it added. "I'll see what I can do," said Brutha, backing away. "And I'm being very reasonable in the circumstances," the tortoise shouted after him. "You don't sing badly, mind you," it added, as an afterthought. I've heard worse," as Brutha's grubby robe disappeared through the gateway. "Puts me in the mind of that time there was the affliction of plagues in Pseudopolis. it said quietly as the footsteps faded. What a wailing and gnashing of teeth was there, all right. It sighed. Great days. Great days.